When we think of the ecology of Houston, likely the first place many of us jump to is the urban jungle of the city. Few of us realize that Houston is actually a hotspot for diverse animal and plant life, and these are given refuge by our networks of prairies, bayous, and wetlands. While many of these natural areas have been paved over, the city still hosts a staggering array of different plants and animals and incredible places to reconnect with the wilderness that abounds our region. Today on the program, we're talking about exactly that. How easy it is to find and connect to nature all around us in the city, and great ways to learn more about how we can get involved in preserving it. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor and the Associate Director in Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you like the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today I'm joined by two of our Gulf Streams researchers, Alex Little and Caroline Pollan, and we're talking about a field guide to Houston wildlife and nature called Wild Houston. So we are delighted today to sit down with ecologists and authors Suzanne Simpson and John Williams, who are behind this wonderful Wild Houston book. John, Suzanne, thank you so much for joining.
Glad to be
for
here.
having us.
So just to start us off, can you introduce yourselves a little to our listeners and tell us a little bit about what brought you into environmental work and ultimately creating this book?
Sure, I'll kick us off. I am an ecologist. My day job is with the Galveston Bay Foundation, where I work in land conservation, trying to conserve coastal habitats and the resources of Galveston Bay. In terms of what brought me into the environmental sector, it was a little bit like since birth almost. Whenever I was a young kid, I watched this show called The Crocodile Hunter with Steve Irwin, and I was like, I want to do that, or as close as I can to doing that. And so ever since then, I had a keen interest in wildlife. And the more you learn about wildlife, the more you understand how critical habitats are for wildlife to exist. And so that led me to a path with a career in land conservation and as an ecologist. And as someone that lives in the city of Houston, it was important to me to have that connection with nature in my backyard. And, I found that when people just kind of open their eyes, they are shocked at what is contained even in really heavily built environments and in the urban center. So I wanted to sort of bring that to the forefront, and that was part of the inspiration for writing the book. And I'll let John take it from there.
Great intro. My background is a lot like Suzanne's, kind of, born with an innate fascination with the creepy crawlies, and that kind of leads you down a path to college. In college, to do something in sciences. So I ended up coming out with an ecology degree and jumping into environmental consulting. Most of the focus now is on endangered species, and stream and wetland mitigation is something I'm passionate about. And groups like Suzanne, Galveston Bay, they're integral in that locally. So as far as the book, I'm not from Houston. I'm from South Texas, but I've been here long enough to where it's grown on me, raising my family here. And when presented with the option to join Suzanne and start on this project, what better way to get out the message of conservation, and the importance of ecological knowledge and spreading the good word, as we like to say, than to put it on paper and hopefully reach a big audience.
Terrific.
Yeah, so for our next question, I just wanted to start off by saying I also had a really great time reading y'all's book. I feel like I learned a lot that I didn't know. But the whole time I felt like I couldn't stop thinking how impressive it was for y'all to have compiled such an extensive resource like Wild Houston. So can you tell us a bit about your experience researching all these species? Was it overwhelming, exciting? And how did you approach it?
Sure. Yes, it was overwhelming. Also exciting. You know, not something either of us have done. We both write a lot in our careers from a technical writing standpoint, but this is kind of a whole different ball game. Lots of research, lots of late nights. This isn't either. We both have day jobs, so this is kind of a labor of love. So yeah, learning the process took some time. Maybe it took a little longer than we first anticipated. COVID had a little bit to do with that, but what do you think, Suzanne?
One thing I would emphasize to naturalists of all ages is that no one was born knowing all this. It's just taking time in the field, taking time outside of work to learn this stuff, and it's just born from passion. And so while it may seem like a really large, maybe overwhelming, like compendium of knowledge, it is extremely attainable for anyone to learn this stuff. And that's what I love about ecology and the outdoors and this book is that anyone can be at this resource for someone else in their life. You just have to go out and look and ask questions.
Well, thank you so much. I also was a big fan of the book. But one of the things that really caught my eye was you use this term novel ecosystems to refer to the ways in which urbanization and human impact have altered what ecosystems look like and what species make up their composition. I was really fascinated by this idea because it ties into where we should be prioritizing conservation efforts and whether conservationists and ecologists should be focused more on this idea of ecological purity that you mentioned, or more so the general functioning of ecosystems. And I would love if you could talk a little bit more about this novel ecosystem idea and how it relates to Houston's wildlife.
Sure, yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. And that part of the writing was basically me putting down the internal monologue that I have in my head a lot and putting it down onto paper because there's certainly a balancing act between wanting ecosystems to reflect what they looked like historically. And that usually seems to be people's primary aim. And then understanding that the built environment and human modifications have altered our ecosystems to a point where we can't take ourselves out of them and expect them to look exactly like they did hundreds of years ago. And also that we can't spin our wheels and use our limited resources trying to recreate a painting that is never just going to be it's just never going to be realized in our new ecosystem. So novel ecosystems is a concept of where you have these new urbanized ecosystems that are a mix of old and new. You have old species that you would have historically seen in an area, and then you have some species that are new. And most of those new species are not threatening and they're not invasive, but some of them are. So it's like, okay, where do we put our resources into making sure that we have a diverse ecosystem that's also healthy and self-sustaining? That's a real balancing act for ecologists all over the world. We have a very urbanized world, and Houston is one of those places where you're going to see it front and center because of our humid subtropical climate. A lot of species can come here and they like it here, they thrive. So how do we, have our ecosystems reflect the old and the new?
Something that I love in what you're saying about that is just, you mentioned that idea of like, it can't be the painting. And I think what's so important about that is also it indicates it's not fixed, right? It's not this kind of static image that is unchanging, but that ecology naturally is evolving and adapting on its own. And then especially when we integrate humans into that picture, that we have to be responsive, and that really demands this kind of thought about, yeah, of course we want to think about what do we want this ecosystem to look like, but it's a living, breathing thing, and it's not going to be remain that, in perpetuity.
Exactly. And I think
Yep.
a great example of that is the presence of the brown anole in Houston. We have a native anole here called the green anole or the Carolina anole. And now, if you live in an urban area, you're mostly seeing brown anoles. Brown anoles are from Cuba and the Caribbean. Now, chances are, even without human intervention, that species would have made its way to us eventually just through natural species migrations. But we expedited that. Humans absolutely expedited the colonization of this area by brown anoles. In response to that, green anoles are rapidly evolving bigger toe pads so that they can take to more arboreal areas because the brown anoles are kicking them out of the terrestrial areas where they prefer. Brown anoles generally have a more brash personality, they're more territorial. So green anoles are taking to the trees. Now I miss seeing green anoles everywhere, but I also understand that this is what's happening around the southeast. And I'm not, it's not a great use of our resources collectively to focus on nuking the brown anoles. They've found a niche. The green anoles are changing their niche. And that's sort of the balancing act that you see happening in cities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember reading that part of the book, and I was like, I noticed that on the Rice campus. Like, I noticed that there were these, like a different composition of anoles than what I was used to back when I lived in Austin. I have another question relating to the human impact on species in Houston. So, relating to a term you used in the book, synurbanization, which was really fascinating to me as someone who also studies ecology and evolution. Could you explain synurbanization to the listeners who may be unfamiliar with this concept?
Yeah, synurbanization is the differences that you're going to see in wildlife and natural resources in urban areas versus non-urban areas. So wildlife in urban areas are going to have specific adaptations to the built environment that you're not going to see in rural areas. So you might see an animal develop a broader palette of diet. It always helps if you're going to live in a city to be flexible, to be adjustable. So you see these synerbic populations starting to develop that have different palates, different tastes, even different life expectancies. Coyotes in urban environments have been shown to have longer life expectancies than those in rural environments. Well, it's because there's a lot of easy pickings for their food everywhere. So it's that kind of changes that we're seeing, and they're taking place very quickly on an evolutionary scale. And the city is sort of the epicenter of where you can find these changes happening and do that research that's really important to understand how species evolve to an urban environment.
And then, okay, so I guess if we're moving on to our next question, so we're still talking a bit about kind of novel ecosystems and the introduction of new species into ecosystems. And so how does the introduction of non-native species influence wildlife around Houston? We often think of these as negative factors, but are there any positive impacts to the introduction of new species?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of an example of a positive impact. Maybe to an extent pollinators, but we have our own native wildflowers and whatnot to take care of that. I'm struggling to find a positive. Now there's some, like, going back to another lizard, the Mediterranean gecko is a non-native gecko from the Mediterranean that I'm sure we've all seen around gas station lights or your front porch light. So that was a niche that wasn't filled by any native animal. So it's filling a niche that was void. It's not necessarily a positive or a negative. Maybe it provides a prey item for certain things. Owls eat them. I'm sure there's snakes eat them. But top of my head, I can't think of a positive invasive species. All that's popping in my head is tallow trees that choke out our native prairies, or McCartney Rose that does the same. Suzanne, do you have any examples? I'm just
Well, I think that what we're hitting on is the difference between like an introduced species versus an invasive species. So not every new species to an ecosystem is going to become an invasive species. And those that are invasive species need to be managed, but many of the species that we find in cities, don't really sit in the binary of positive or negative. They form their own complex relationships with those ecosystems. So I'll give you an example. I don't know why it's always the brown anole, but by the way, for our listeners that may not be familiar, anoles are a type of lizard. They're like a small lizard that you're going to see around your yard. But there was a moment where I saw a loggerhead shrike, which is one of our native, mostly grassland species of birds. And I saw that it had impaled a brown anole on a rose bush. And that's how they eat their food, is they're called the butcher bird. They take the species, they take their prey, they kind of like hang it like a meat hook, and then they come back to it later. It's super metal. Loggerhead shrikes are awesome. Look them up. But it is like somewhat, you're walking through, like in my case, a prairie, and you're like, well, so in that
You
we
made
had
a surprised face, I should note there for listeners who couldn't see through the radio.
That's what that whale was. So in that case, you have a native species, the loggerhead shrike, preying on an invasive species, the brown anole, and using an invasive plant species, the Bradford pear, to impale that anole onto it. So that loggerhead shrike would be able to find food without the presence of those two non-native and invasive species. However, it shows the ability of city animals to adapt and be like, well, this is a new prey item and a new way of making this a prey item, and I'm going to do it. And that's how animals are able to thrive in our environments.
That's so interesting. Thank you. I have a question about a slightly different subject. So one of the chapters in your book that really interested me was the one about how we can alter our backyards or other green spaces to make them more wildlife friendly, easier to maintain, and better for environmental and human health. So what are the best ways, in y'all's opinions, that people can improve their backyard to gain these benefits?
Sure. Plant natives is always what comes first in my head, especially for our native pollinators. The plight of the American bumblebee is something that catches headlines. And even though it does, I don't know that people know just the status of a lot of our native bees, wasps, that almost all are declining. And most of it is because the lack of native pollinators throughout their range, whether it's urbanization or invasive species like king ranch bluestem or Bermuda grass that just dominate what formerly were our prairies. So I'd say plant native, number one. It's small scale, it's easy to do, and even in a small urban environment, you can really up your biodiversity surprisingly. So
100%. Yeah, plant native is the number one thing that you can do. Plant native plants, source your plants locally. And remember that it doesn't have to be a whole scale ripping out of your existing landscaping and converting it to something brand new. If you're wanting to figure out if native plants are for you, small, have a spot in your yard that is kind of your little native plant garden. And then honestly, I truly believe when you see what comes to those flowers, what comes to those plants that you've never seen in your yard before, you're going to get bit by the bug, not literally, and you're going to want to expand the amount of native plants that you have access to. And I don't know why I feel the need to go in on the honeybee today. But I mean, John is right when he's talking about the plight of the American bumblebee and a lot of our native pollinators. The European honeybee is not a native species, and it essentially acts like a livestock animal in our ecosystems. It's our native bumblebees, our solitary pollinators that really, really need our help. And native plants is a great way to give them a leg up.
Something that you that you bring up in that that I don't often hear, and I want to go back to for just a second is, I think we hear a lot and pretty often, planting native plants is really important. But actually, you mentioned sourcing locally, and of course, I can see that would be significant for local economies and for growers here in town, which is really, really important. But are there other reasons that we should be sourcing locally? Are there other advantages to that, or particular reasons that I wouldn't be aware of that we should be thinking about where we're actually buying our plants from?
Uh, yeah, maybe not biodiversity related, but if it's grown here, it has a better chance of surviving here. It's native or not native of plants. I always like to check and see, where's this nursery? Did it go through our winters and our summers to know if this plant can take all that Houston can dish out in a year?
We do throw a lot at plants. It's
So
Sure. I just would emphasize what John said, that we have hyper local adaptations sometimes that we see from our native plants, and it requires the consumer to be discerning and to be educated. Right now, a lot of that burden is placed on the consumer to understand that this may be a milkweed that's native to Texas, but it's not native to Southeast Texas. And so it may be adaptable. It may be adapted to different conditions than the native milkweeds that you see naturally in our ecosystems in this part of the area. A reminder that Texas is so big. We have many, many different ecoregions, and all of those ecoregions speak to a very specific climate. So the more local you can buy your plants from source, the better. At the same time, I am a big proponent of not letting perfect be the enemy of good, and that our source of native plants is a real bottleneck for people to grow out their gardens. So I understand having to make compromises sometimes because our hyper-local plants may not always be available at a nursery.
Great, thank you.
So talking a little bit about like the different habitats and places that different species can survive. I guess in my neighborhood, right next to Rice, I often see a great blue heron walking around the streets at night. And I didn't know what kind of bird it was until I actually read y'all's book. And I was really surprised to hear that great blue herons are actually aquatic creatures, or like birds that love living next to the water. And so I was really surprised to hear that in my neighborhood in the middle of Houston, there's a great blue heron that's constantly around. I actually saw him last night and took a picture. And so I was wondering, could this be a consequence of habitat loss, or do you see often like Houston's urban sprawl influencing the behavior of these animals?
I'd say yes and yes. Some species, they can adapt to that. I remember years ago, I took my kids to Disney World, and we're standing in front of Magic Kingdom. And like I always do, I'm looking for lizards or snakes or wherever I am. So we're in front of the castle, and I point to my son, who's maybe 3 at the time, 3 or 4. There's a great egret, which is comparable to a great blue, and it's eating the knolls off of some hedges right in front of the castle. To me, that there's 1,000 people around, and that's a marsh bird. That's an aquatic adapted bird that it's got a beak like that for a reason, and that S-shaped neck that can grab fish and crawfish. But it had adapted to the abundance of brown anoles in this urban setting. It's a testament to the bird for sure, but it's also kind of you hate to see it, because who knows what was under that castle before it was built. Maybe a marsh or Rice University might have been built on, who knows, marsh.
Oh, weird. Yeah, right on bayous. A tiny little bit of one still runs through it. And yeah. And it doesn't at all mean that half our buildings on campus are sinking a good chunk of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. I actually wanted to ask about bayous. So one of the ecosystems that characterizes Houston is the bayou. A lot of the book is dedicated to talking about bayous and bayou animals. So could you just share with us what makes a bayou, and why are they so critical to Houston's wildlife?
Yeah, a bayou is basically a slow moving brown water. I mean, if you ask, it's one of those things where if you ask 20 people what a bayou is, you'll get 20 different answers. But essentially, it is a slow-moving body of brown water, usually. And in Houston, we have plenty of them, and they're integral to our history because they're the reason that Houston became an economic power within the United States. It's because we had access from the sea to the Gulf, to the Galveston Bay, and then up through the ship channel. People were able to have commerce come all the way up. And so our bayous really tell the story of our cities. Now, in terms of wildlife, bayous are basically interconnected superhighways that wildlife are able to use to get from place to place or to get from their feeding grounds to their breeding grounds. That is the main source of water and of connectivity that our wildlife are using to make their lives and to thrive here in the city. So you can't really talk about wildlife in Houston without talking about the importance of bayous.
I'm so glad that you actually bring up that kind of history of the commerce of the city and why we're here, because I think it's something that, that for listeners who haven't yet read the book, but are, I'm sure, racing out to get it right now and start diving in immediately, it's really the place that you start as you actually think very deeply about why is Houston in this place? Who are the people who lived here before it was colonized, before it became Houston? And really thinking deeply around some of the practices that, certainly you're thinking about Houston's ecology and native flora and fauna, but a bigger part of this is actually also why do we exist the way we exist, and how does that shape where we live today. And so I'm really curious if you want to talk a little bit about, you did some wonderful historical research that's really fascinating to read through, whether you're really into ecology or actually kind of an urban history nerd like I am. And so I'd love to hear both a little about that process of research, but also why it's so important to start with that kind of evolution of how we're here and why we're here to get into what our ecology looks like today.
Yeah, for me, it was important to debunk some of the myths that I heard about Houston in my childhood. So I grew up here, and I can tell you, I heard from many teachers that Houston was essentially a wasteland until we did the good work of paving it over, and then it became habitable. And whenever you look at what the Allen brothers used as their postcard to advertise Houston, they characterize Houston as a hilly hamlet. And from then on, it's been kind of the Wild West out here in terms of our development. So I would say that the start of Houston certainly reflects the current situation that we've put ourselves in, where we have a lot of development that has been done unsustainably. For me, it's important to go back and appreciate, first of all, the original inhabitants of our area and how they were able to survive. First of all, without air conditioning, which I cannot understand, but just use the resources that we have available here, because there was an abundance before there was concrete. And so for me to uncouple that was a really fascinating process. And one of my favorite and the most challenging parts of writing this book was going back in time and trying to piece together how we got where we are now.
Well, you detail scores of animals in addition to all of the history that you talk about, scores of animals and plants throughout the book. So could you tell us about some of the most surprising or some of your favorite plants, animals that you researched while writing the book?
Sure. So for those that have read the book, it opens with probably my favorite. It's a story about alligator snapping turtles in Houston, and more specifically in the most urbanized of Houston. So alligator snapping turtles are largest freshwater turtle native to America, dinosaur looking animal. I mean, they never come out of the water to bask. They are scraggly. They seem ill-tempered because they'll leave their mouth agape when if you ever get to handle one. But so they were virtually unknown to the bayous of Houston. There's individuals that would wash up here or there, or reports of fishermen catching them, until the last 10 years or so. And there's a team of scientists that Suzanne and I both lucky enough to tag along with them a little bit, that kind of followed up on some of these sightings. So what's really going on in the bayous of Houston? Has anybody ever really put any effort to see population dynamics, the status? Where are they? What are they doing? So this group, through lots and lots of work, found that there's a bustling population of these massive prehistoric turtles all the way up to downtown. So you think of, running along Buffalo Bayou, there's not much to it. Where at least where it's not concreted, there's enough habitat that there's individuals there that, they could be 100 years old. So they've seen everything Houston has to offer. I know they tagged an individual pre and post Harvey, and I know we all saw the pictures of what Harvey did specifically to Buffalo Bayou and downtown, and it had moved like 100 yards. So following up on those stories and speaking with some of those people are my friends, just their experiences with that particular animal, it kind of a microcosm of the wildlife in Houston that's still here. I know people don't think of Houston as a wildlife hotspot, but I think they can kind of be the champion. The turtles can be the champion of, hey, there's still a ton here. There's lots to see. There's really a lot of exciting stories like that we tried to tell in the book, and there's still many more that we couldn't. But I think the alligator snapping turtle for me is number one, and kind of the ambassador for wild Houston to me.
100% agree. And it just goes to show that we've inhabited Houston for hundreds of years. We're less than 10 years into figuring out that an ancient prehistoric reptile has been living in our most populated bayou. That's crazy. So it not only speaks to what Houston is able to provide already, but what new discoveries are we going to make? Because there's more out there. Who's going to make them? I hope it's you. It's like this. I definitely want alligator snapping turtles to be the inspiration for people continuing to look for the unexpected.
Do you have any other favorites you want to share, Suzanne? Or
Oh, I have so many favorites. Yeah, I know. I'm like trying to not talk about a reptile because I feel like we've done nothing but talk about reptiles. Of course, that's like the first thing that comes to mind. I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna put a shout out to the buttermilk racer. Buttermilk racer is a snake that lives north of I-10. So you want to head to like the Woodlands, Spring, Cypress, those areas to check it out. The reason it's so cool is because it exhibits this white patchy buttermilk pattern, and it is a gorgeous snake, but it has a pretty limited range, and so people will come to Houston to specifically go out and find a buttermilk racer. In fact, I think John just took someone out the other week to go help him find a very well-known herper. A herper is someone that looks for reptiles and amphibians, to go find the buttermilk racer, because it's a kind of a gold mine here for this very specific subspecies of racer. Once you get south of I-10, you're going to see yellow-bellied racers, and sometimes you can get like an intergrade between a yellow-belly and a buttermilk where it exhibits traits of both. It's just a really, really cool animal that has interesting morphology, and like no two are the same. Like you're never going to see a buttermilk racer that is boring. So go flip some logs and see if you can find one.
To that point, I'm curious. I want to go back for a second, because I mean, you've mentioned a couple times now going out and looking at animals, seeing these assisting people, but also getting to go along with scientists as they went to look at various things. And I think between both, we were talking about historical research, then there's this kind of on-site. I mean, I think you've deployed quite a few different ways that you were really researching and putting together this compendium, certainly, of animals and wildlife around Houston, but also this kind of guide and history of the area. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about some of that research process, and just, it seems like the wide range of methods and approaches you took to put together this volume.
Sure. So like we started with, Suzanne and I both have a background in it, innate interest. So as far as research for a lot of these species, I've been researching, air quotes, my whole life, just reading any native guide that comes out. I want all the new snake guides about Texas, or the new plant guides, just just that's what I'm into. So the research was a lot of it had been done, and now it's putting it on paper. And also, it's like we go through our list of species that we want to talk about. So, well, I don't know too much about this. Let me reach out to some experts that maybe we know, we don't know, and any kind of tidbits they can give us. That what message should we put out with this species that either we want somebody to know or we didn't know, we want everybody else to know. Just to me, one that always stuck out to me, and I just hadn't thought of it before the book, was flying squirrels. So I don't know that everybody knows that we have southern flying squirrels here. They're native. It's a native animal. It's, sugar gliders and the people keep those as pets, but
It's on the Rice campus.
Yeah, and they're very urbanized. The first time I saw one, I was at a wedding in Katy, and it was during the best man speech, and it was this beautiful venue where they had a nice patio and these big oak trees, and I'm looking out the window in the lights, and I see one glide across where we're all going to be dancing in 10 minutes. I'm hitting my wife. I'm like, look out the window. She's like, it's in the middle of the speech. I'm like, that was a flying squirrel. That was a flying squirrel. Those kind of, that was a light bulb for me, is, wow, we have this animal that I've never heard anybody seeing one or talk about it or anything, but it's all over the entire city. Just nobody looks or nobody knows. So getting a message out like that, so I couldn't wait to dive in and take somebody else's words, because I'm not a southern flying squirrel expert, but put that in the book and say, isn't this incredible? Don't you want to know this? So.
Yeah, I think my favorite part of the research has to do with the field trip section, where I basically had permission to go to places that I've either visited before and wanted to revisit, or got to visit for the first time, places that I've always wanted to go, and write about them. And just it was just a full, it was a very pure experience, because I'm just trying to, what am I seeing? What am I smelling? How is this trail, how is this built? And so I really enjoyed kind of taking that in with fresh eyes. And also getting to talk to some of the stewards of these lands, like the Trinity River National Wildlife Refuge. I got to hang out with the biologist that's out there every day in these bottomlands. And it's a place that not very many people visit, part of why it was included in the book. And it's a place that's highly dynamic. I mean, right now, the trail that I walked on, I would need a kayak. Or maybe an airboat.
Wow.
It's just really depends on the external conditions. I really enjoyed getting to experience those types of places, be it something that I had visited before or for the very first time. That was a great research aim of mine. And there were certainly parts where I'm, having to write the book, and I'm like, oh, this book about the outdoors is preventing me from going outdoors because I have to write about the outdoors. And
A vicious circle there.
it is. We're never outside as much as we want to be, but boy, it sure made you appreciate what you had and the time that we got to be outside doing work for this book.
That's really perfect, because that's actually exactly where I wanted to go next. Is the ending of the book has this series of about 20 kind of field trips you can do around the greater area of the city, to see just all kinds of different really spectacular things. And I was hoping you would talk about the field trips, and also, I'd love to hear from each of you. What are one or two of your favorites of those field trips that you want to recommend to folks? Which is totally unfair, because they all look fantastic, but as there are quite a few, I'm curious if you can give us a little insight into some that might be really well worth our time. And I'm looking forward to going out and starting to go on some of those on my own very soon.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of it depends on my mood or the time of year or whatnot, because obviously we included all of them in the book because there's something special about each of them. But my answer to this question is and always will be Brazos Bend State Park. So that's at the northern extent of the Columbia Bottomlands, which is a forest that only exists in Texas, the forest type, ecotype, around the Colorado, Brazos, and St. Bernard rivers. So within our area, it's kind of the closest chunk that you can really get a good look at is within Brazos Bend State Park. majestic oaks. There's always wildlife to see. And then around the park, kind of the main attraction are a series of lakes, man-made lakes. That if you don't see an alligator on your trip, look again. You're usually stepping over them on the trail. Not that it's dangerous, but there's no fences. You feel like you're at a zoo almost, or a safari walk because
Wow.
of what you see. In the winter, the waterfowl migration is incredible. Can be incredible. So I lived in Sugar Land for years, and that was kind of a go-to spot with my family. So it means a little more because my kids. That's where a lot of their introduction to nature was there. And also a little jewel in Sugar Land that's in the book is called Cullinan Park, which is kind of had a strange history on how it became a park. It was farmland that was donated to the city of Sugar Land and ended up being kind of managed by City of Houston. But it's kind of a little gem in the middle of urban sprawl, which several of these places are, and we definitely want to put that message out there. But it's a unique wetland system with a fantastic boardwalk, another alligator spot. I guess that's maybe a theme with me that those are some of my favorite animals to interact with. But fantastic birding, constant improvement on trails. I sound like I work for them, but I don't. Those are kind of my two, and I'm more of a get muddy in the wetlands and the weeds guy. So I stick with the wetter parks. Get some muddy boots.
Great, thank you. Suzanne?
If I could add to it, I would say that, of course, the Trinity River National Wildlife Refuge and the Waugh Bridge. So these are go from being a very wilderness experience to a very urban experience. But what you can find in both places are bats. Two different species of bats. So at the Trinity River National Wildlife Refuge, they were adding a parcel to their refuge system, and there was a shed on it. And they went to explore the shed, and they found the largest maternal colony of Ravenex big-eared bats. And they were like, well, this is an amazing discovery. And so that's one of the kind of calling cards of the Trinity River National Wildlife Refuge is this really healthy population of Ravenex big-eared bats. And we have some pictures of them in the book. It's a face that only a mother could love, but they are really, really cool with their, Doppler ears. And then on the other side, right in the heart of the city, is the Waugh Bridge bat colony, which is a colony of Mexican free-tailed bats. And those are often the bats that are a little bit more adapted to urban areas. And they're living underneath the Waugh Bridge every day around sunset. They will emerge. The colonies are particularly large in the summer and fall whenever they've had their pups. And that is a really cool visual to see those bats come out from under the bridge. If I can add one more place that's different from either is Lake Charlotte, which is just north of I-10. It's the largest westernmost cypress swamp in the United States, and it is the typification of a hidden gem. Very few people know about it. Very few people go and visit it, but it's eminently accessible. It's just off one of our biggest highways. And it is gorgeous. You're going to see prothonotary warblers nesting, just tons of gars out there. The gars are a freshwater fish, and it is just monstrous bald cypress trees. So it really feels like almost a museum or a cathedral for these trees to get to view them. They're, who knows how old some of them are out there. So it's a very cool place to visit. Bring your kayak.
I'm dying to go out there. Bald cypress is my favorite tree. It takes me back to home, and I'm really looking forward to that. I will also plug for folks who may not know, going back to your Waugh Bridge, if you would like, and it's not terribly expensive, Buffalo Bayou Preserve actually offers boat tours of Buffalo Bayou, and one of them is a batting tour that will take you directly out to the bridge. And I took a group of high school students who were in part of a summer program we ran last year, and universally beloved. Great experience. If you can take that opportunity, I definitely encourage listeners to go in and take the boat tour of Buffalo Bayou. It's a really well spent couple of hours of your day.
Oh, thank you so much for the recommendations. I'll definitely be doing some of these field trips. Um, and another question I have is Houston is this amazingly biodiverse city encompassing many different ecosystems, but these ecosystems are increasingly coming under threat from development, pollution, and much more. I was wondering if you had any insight into how Houstonians can get involved to protect our wildlife.
Sure. One thing that I like to spread is your voice can matter with how some of the infrastructure of our city is built. So specifically like TxDOT, bridges, roads, Harris County flood control, they'll put their projects out on public notice and have public meetings where they want the input from the public that will be directly impacted by their projects. They want their input to say, what are y'all looking for? What solutions maybe do y'all have? Just give us input on our project. And something that I push is nature-based solutions, which they may not be the perfect solution for the biodiversity end or the get the job done end, whatever your project is. But they're the balance in the middle of how can we meet the goals of our project, but also include a biodiversity element to this. So with runoff capture or detention, you can build a big bowl, or you can make a functioning wetland ecosystem that meets the goals of your project. With that's floodwater detention or whatever it may be, while also providing to whatever extent a little bit of green space, a little bit of biodiversity, something that's not just a concrete channel like a lot of our bayous are. I think our institutions are starting to get away from that, I hope, as more people become aware of maybe what we can do that meets the goals of projects while also as a biodiversity element, and how that is, that could be classified into the benefit of, or what benefits are there to everyone around. Pushing nature-based solutions to me is something I see growing in the future, and I hope more and more people present that to the entities that build our infrastructure and push for it. So they see that that's what we'd rather have, that than a concrete hexagonal channel.
Yeah, nature-based solutions is definitely has a more prominent seat at the table with our public officials and with the general public than it has in the past, than it's enjoyed in the past. And a lot of that has to do with the recent massive storm events that have come over our city, and us realizing that our gray, hard infrastructure solutions, they didn't provide everything we needed. So instead of just focusing on engineering right angles, we need to provide some room for the rivers to expand, for the bayous to expand. And we can do that by not developing in the floodplain. We can do that by conserving tracts of land that are more susceptible to flood damage. And so I would encourage people to also get involved with your local land trust. Land trusts are organizations that exist to conserve land. Galveston Bay Foundation is one. A few great others are Bayou Land Conservancy. They work in the Lake Houston watershed. Coastal Prairie Conservancy, they work in the west side of Houston and beyond. Houston Audubon, they're a bird-focused organization, but also conserve land, especially coastal habitats that are important for bird migration. Those organizations are doing a lot of that boots on the ground, grassroots work to make sure that the land that needs to be conserved for wildlife habitat and to limit loss of life and property is being done.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for chatting with us today and sharing some of this really exciting book. The book is Wild Houston, Exploring the Amazing Nature in and Around the Bayou City. Suzanne Simpson, John Williams are the authors who've been speaking with us. Thank you so much for your time. And I can't wait to take up this book and go on some of those field trips as we were talking about.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, call us up. We'll go out with you.
Sounds good.
Yeah, anytime.
We'll go now to our researcher, Alex Little, who has a piece for you on how to reduce your carbon output simply by mixing up a little bit of how you eat.
Hey y'all, this is Alex. In this short segment, I'll be introducing simple ways that folks can integrate their own DIY climate solutions into their everyday lives. Today, I want to talk a little bit about climate conscious eating. One of the first things people tend to think about when it comes to green eating is something like vegetarianism or veganism, which can seem really daunting to most people, especially because it would require cutting out all of your favorite foods that involve meat products and animal products. Although plant-based diets do have tremendous positive impacts on our environment, which I'll discuss in just a moment, there are plenty of smaller steps individuals can take to reduce their so-called carbon footprint. Buying local foods is an excellent way to reduce your emissions by cutting out the environmental toll of transportation. Another great outcome of eating local foods has to do with water justice. For example, when we eat produce which has been grown in other parts of the world, we're also consuming all of the water and other resources which went into cultivating it. In doing so, we're removing all of that water from the region's local water cycle, hurting not only the communities, but the entire ecosystem there within. When grocery shopping, keep an eye out for those labels that say "produced locally," or even check the product label's fine print to find its place of origin. Cutting down your food waste can also be a really simple way to reduce your impact on our climate. We can treat food waste differently based on whether or not it can be composted. Cutting down on food waste can also be a really great way to reduce your impact on our environment. We can treat food waste differently based on whether or not it can be composted. Composting is essentially the practice of collecting all of your food scraps and allowing them to decompose back into soil, which will be nutrient-rich and help support plant growth. Compostable items include essentially anything that you can eat or anything that grew out of the ground. You may also compost things like eggshells or even shredded paper, cardboard, and napkins. Many people compost their own food scraps in a very large compost bin, about 3 feet in diameter, turning them regularly until they decompose into soil, at which point they can return all the nutrients back into their yards. Not only does composting help reduce your waste and support plant health, but it also has some other environmental benefits, like preventing soil erosion and increasing soil's water capacity. However, not all of our food waste is compostable. There are things like wrappers and plastics that our food comes packaged in that we cannot introduce into our environment. Looking for food items with minimal packaging, buying items you use often in bulk, and avoiding single-use plastics are great ways to start reducing your waste. Ensuring you're only buying and consuming what you will eat can help prevent wasted food scraps from entering our landfills. Planning out your meals ahead of time can be a useful method to do so. As I mentioned before, though, one of the most impactful changes you can make to your diet is shifting towards plant-based eating. In 2020, BBC followed 3 individuals tracking dietary and lifestyle habits for 2 weeks. However, each participant practiced different dietary habits. One had no restrictions, one was vegetarian, and one was vegan. After the 2 weeks, a sustainability researcher conducted an analysis on the estimated emissions of each individual. The study reported that the individual who consumed animal products produced 48.8 kilograms of CO2 per week. The vegetarian only produced 16.9 kilograms of CO2, and the vegan produced only 9.9 kilograms. The primary reason for this stark drop has to do with the negative impact animal products, meat in particular, has on our environment. Oftentimes, animal products require such extensive processing to be safe for human consumption, which requires significant energy input. Additionally, the farming of cattle requires unsustainable quantities of water. Alternatively, plant-based products tend to require minimal processing, and when purchased locally, they'll count significantly less towards your emissions. Although BBC reports lower emissions for the vegan diet, many other reports have also shown instances where vegetarianism can be just as effective as veganism. So that's great news for those of us who may not be ready to transition into a completely plant-based diet. The ultimate goal is to just cut down on the amount of animal products we're consuming, even if that doesn't mean we entirely eliminate them. Perhaps you can make a conscious effort to reduce your consumption of meat and dairy products before entirely transitioning to a vegetarian or even vegan lifestyle. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope some of these suggestions inspire you to implement your own climate solutions. We can all do our part to adapt towards a more sustainable lifestyle, and although your contribution may feel trivial, it has a really great impact if everyone pitches in. Thanks, y'all.
For how to get involved this week, I'd like to talk about the Houston Climate Movement, which is an organization of local actors who've gotten together over the last couple of years to meet and discuss climate change, environmental justice, and various issues facing our region really specifically. They've hosted 2 annual symposiums now that have been really important for connecting local advocates and people who just are really invested in environmental and climate issues. They actually have a monthly meeting, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you'd like to get involved in doing something that you think would make you feel more environmentally connected or a little bit more engaged this week, I would suggest that on June 11th, which is tomorrow, Tuesday, from 7 to 9 p.m., you can attend a online meeting of the Houston Climate Movement. And so that'll be from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. You can Google Houston Climate Movement, find their website, go directly there. You can also find information on this on Air Alliance Houston's website, which is airalliancehouston.org. And you can sign up to join any of these meetings. They generally have a speaker at these to talk about different issues going on in the area. And so I would always, suggest this is a great way to get involved, but especially since they're having the monthly meeting on Tuesday, we thought we would let you know about that and just shout it out as a great opportunity to meet other folks who are really thinking around these issues and who want to make a better world for all of us. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about environmental research initiatives in Houston. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Caroline Pollan and Alex Little. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.